Hi, welcome to the channel. Today's video is titled The Battle of Barnet. This is the War of the Roses. We're going to check this video together. I think somebody sort of suggested we check this video, The War of the Roses, which um, I find quite interesting that we're going to check together. And I love your thoughts and your contribution in the comments below. Let's dive right in.
The Battle of Barnet was fought in 1471 during the Wars of the
1471.
Roses in medieval England. The Wars of the Roses were a dynastic civil war which pitched two rival factions of the royal House of Plantagenet, the Houses of York and the House of Lancaster, against each other in a 30-year conflict to
30
see who would
years?
wear the crown of England.
Wow.
If you've watched my video about the Battle of Towton, you will know that in 1461, after 6 years of the Civil War, the Yorkists under Edward IV had won a crushing victory over the Lancastrians. In fact, there's a link appearing, well, about now. So if you want to get that backstory, watch that and now come back to this sequel. Do that now. After the Battle of Towton, the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, along with his wife and son, had fled to the safety of Scotland, whilst Edward had returned in triumph to London, where he was crowned king at Westminster Abbey. But the Wars of the Roses were by no means over. 3 years later, in 1464, Henry VI launched an invasion into the north of England, but his forces were defeated at Hexham. Forced to go on the run, Henry managed to keep one step ahead of the Yorkist supporters for nearly a year, but eventually his luck ran out and he was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, fled to her native France along with their son and heir, Edward, Prince of Wales. With Henry under lock and key in the Tower of London and his formidable wife, Margaret of Anjou, stuck across the Channel, there was, for the first time in 9 years, peace in England.
Wow.
And the House of York were most firmly in control. And Edward had achieved that position in no small part due to the support of his cousin, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Warwick the Kingmaker.
I think I've seen a video about Warwick. I've not checked it, but I saw it. Potentially, we're gonna check that because I love history and I love to dig up to check and to expand my knowledge, especially in regards to lots of these things, and to see how some of these are applicable to the current society, the current world, if that makes sense, right? But this looks interesting.
But now that he wore the crown on his head, Edward's relationship with the Kingmaker began to sour. Fundamentally, Warwick felt that Edward owed him big time. In other words, the young king should do what cousin Warwick wanted him to do, and should ensure that Warwick and the rest of the Neville family be rewarded with power and lands. Edward had other ideas, and it all came to a head when the king fell in love and secretly married a widow from a family of minor gentry, Elizabeth Woodville. You know, this sudden marriage was like a medieval version of running off to the Elvis Chapel in Las Vegas, and Warwick was aghast, as indeed were many of the great noble families of England. The fact that Elizabeth Woodville was from a minor family and not one of the great noble houses in England was bad enough. But what made it worse for Warwick was that he was negotiating a peace treaty with France, which would involve his bachelor cousin marrying a French princess. Now, Warwick's diplomatic masterpiece was shattered, and so was Warwick's reputation. Next up, King Edward refused to give the Nevilles, as far as Warwick was concerned, their just rewards. Those rewards were in the form of the vast land holdings of their bitter rivals in the north of England, the Percy family. Now, the leader of the Percy family, the Earl of Northumberland, was killed fighting on the wrong side, aka the Lancastrian side, at the Battle of Towton, and the Nevilles had their eyes on those lands now. So it came as a rather nasty shock when the young king decided that the Percys could retain them. And finally, we're back to Edward's new wife, Elizabeth Woodville. The king started to elevate members of her family to the nobility and into positions of power. Warwick and many of the other nobles were aghast that these newcomer upstarts were lording it around the court and grabbing power. After
Wow.
all, that was a role the Neville family played, and they didn't enjoy having the boot being put on the other foot.
Hmm.
It was all too much, and Warwick finally snapped. In 1469 he rose in rebellion, but he was outmaneuvered by Edward and he was forced to flee to France.
Wait, potentially this was before or I mean after the War of Roses, right? Because the War of Roses was in 1455 to 1465. So potentially this is after that war, right? Because when he's making reference or saying 1469, I'm trying kind of like, okay, something happened here before, and now this is a different year, right? Let me know because I want to be sure so I'm not confused when he's saying this.
Do you remember who else is in France?
Who?
Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, who was locked up in the Tower of London. And the two of them, Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, formed an unlikely, maybe an unholy, alliance. They would invade England.
Wait,
The Wars of the Roses
wait
was a
first, wait
dynastic
first.
civil war which pitched
The
two
War
rival
of
factions of the royal house of Plantagenet,
let me
the
take
houses
it
of
back
York and
because
the house of
there is a
Lancaster,
particular
against each
war
other in
that
a
I saw
30-year conflict to see
14.
who would wear the crown of
Hold
England.
on, I want to be sure.
If you've watched my video about the Battle of
Okay.
Towton, you will know that in
Oh,
1461, after
1485.
6 years
Oh,
of
I'm
the
so
Civil War,
sorry.
the Yorkists
I'm
under
so
Edward
sorry. Now it
IV had
makes
won a
total
crushing
sense.
victory over the Lancastrians. In fact, there's a link
Eh.
appearing, well, about now. So if you
Oh.
want to get that backstory, watch that, and now
So
come back
let me
to this
understand this
sequel.
because
Do
obviously
that
in
now.
history, when
After the
something is
Battle of Towton, the
happening somewhere,
Lancastrian king,
or no,
Henry VI, along with
somewhere
his
else,
wife and
something else
son,
is
had
happening
fled to the safety of Scotland,
somewhere else, right?
whilst
So
Edward
it's like
had
kind
returned
of
in
like
triumph to
sometimes
London, where he was crowned king at
there's a lot
Westminster Abbey.
happening.
But the
Oh,
Wars of the
now
Roses were by
I got
no
kind of
means
confused there.
over. 3 years later, in
Get
1464,
ahead in the
Henry
game.
VI
I'm so
launched an
sorry. I'm so
invasion
sorry. I
into the
had to
north of
take it
England,
back to be
but his
sure
forces
and
were
to confirm
defeated
the
at
years
Hexham.
because I
Forced
wanted
to
to
go
be
on the
sure
run,
that I
Henry
was not
managed to keep
making a
one step
mistake
ahead of the Yorkist supporters
or
for
making
nearly
a
a year,
mistake with the
but
year.
eventually his luck ran
Why did
out
I
and he
just
was
move from
captured and
1455
imprisoned
to
in the Tower of London.
1465? You make no
Henry's
sense,
wife,
right?
Margaret of Anjou, fled
Apologies
to
for
her
that.
native France along with their son and heir, Edward, Prince of Wales. With Henry under lock and key,
Finally snapped.
Okay.
In 1469 he rose in rebellion, but he was outmaneuvered by Edward and he was forced to flee to France.
Wow.
Do you remember who else is in France? Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, who was locked up in the Tower of London. And the two of them, Warwick and Margaret of Anjou, formed an unlikely, maybe an unholy, alliance. They would invade England, oust Edward, and reinstate Henry VI as king. In the autumn of 1470, Warwick landed in Dartmouth, Devon, and he swept through the south of England, taking London without a fight. King Edward IV and his younger brother, Richard of Gloucester, were forced to flee England and seek safety with their brother-in-law in Burgundy. Back in London, Warwick released Henry VI and paraded him through the city as the rightful King of England. Having put Edward on the throne and then deposed him and reinstated Henry VI, Warwick truly deserved his nickname of the Kingmaker.
Was
But
it?
it wasn't to last. Just 5 months later, Edward was back in England, landing in Yorkshire with an army of mercenaries provided by his brother-in-law, the Duke of Burgundy, and also wealthy Flemish merchants and Burgundian merchants. He and his brothers advanced south towards London, gathering an army as they went. And having managed to slip past Warwick's army in the Midlands, they entered London on the 12th of April, 1471. The unfortunate King Henry VI was removed from Westminster Palace and put back in the Tower of London. Warwick, who had already sent an urgent message to Margaret in France for reinforcements, was racing south from Coventry when he heard the bad news that the capital had been captured by Edward. He spent the night in St Albans, 20 miles north of London, and indeed where the Wars of the Roses had started 16 years previously. And the next day he moved south and positioned his army just to the north of the tiny town of Barnet.
Imagine, wait, imagine a fight for 30 years. 30. That means if you were 6 You be 36. Wow.
Barnet. Nowadays, Barnet is a suburb of London, but at the time it
Mm.
was a tiny town, say 10 miles north of the capital in open countryside. Edward moved out of London to meet him, arriving as night started to fall. In absolute silence and with no campfires lit, Edward moved his army into position in a marshy valley very close to the Lancastrian lines. It must have been a cold night for his troops with no campfires. But the lack of fires did have one saving grace. Because Warwick, whose army outnumbered Edward's by about 15,000 to 10,000, launched a cannon barrage throughout the night towards Edward's army, but the shots went straight over the Yorkists' heads because they were so close to the Lancastrian lines. As dawn broke on the 14th of April 1471, the battlefield at Barnet was covered in dense fog. The armies really couldn't work out where each other were, except for the sounds of armour and marching somewhere in the fog ahead. It must have been an eerie morning as the troops, strained to hear where their enemies were, and then suddenly, seeing them coming out of the gloom towards them. The dark night and the foggy morning had resulted in Edward misplacing his troop dispositions. So rather than facing the Lancastrians square on, his right wing, led by his brother Richard of Gloucester, had overlapped the Lancastrian lines and had no enemy in front of them. Likewise, the Earl of Oxford, commanding the Lancastrian right wing, found himself in the same position too. He had no Yorkists in front of him. In the swirling fog, both Richard of Gloucester and the Earl of Oxford on their opposing armies moved to their left to try and find an enemy to fight, resulting in both the Yorkist and the Lancastrian left wings both being attacked in their flanks. And because of this, these flanking attacks, both armies started to pivot 90 degrees, which was ultimately to have a disastrous consequence for Warwick. In the meantime, however, his right wing under Oxford routed the Yorkist troops in front of them under Lord Hastings. Hastings' men broke and were chased all the way back to Barnet by the Lancastrians, and indeed many then just deserted the battlefield and fled for London for their lives. Once more, Warwick's magic seemed to be working. Gathering his men, who were now pillaging Barnet, Oxford returned to the battlefield. In the fog, confusion reigned. As Oxford's men arrived at where they thought Edward's army would be, they ran into their own army under the Duke of Somerset, which had pivoted 90 degrees.
Okay. Because I'm like, this Barnett one is a different one, but it's still part of the War of the Roses, right? Because potentially, while I was even searching for this War of the Roses, I also saw the Battle of Warwick. There was one other one that I saw. I can't even remember the name exactly. I saw lots of them, and I told myself like I was going to check those ones because they sort of would like link or be like parts and bits and pieces, right? Because in history, one thing I love about history is, and this is the reason why I love to check history, because while one thing is happening here, something else is happening here, and it's more like all of them, they are kind of like linked together or intertwined, right? And sometimes it might be a bit confusing, which potentially also I kind of got confused later on, but it it can be a bit confusing but interesting, right? Because how something is happening here, another thing is happening here, but the same year, different experience, but all linked together. Like wow, just like how I recently or when I checked about the British American War of 1812, and I sort of got to realize that that was the exact same period the Napoleonic War was going on. I did not know that. I did not know that. So I mean, I love to check history to learn for so I'll be able to like, okay, yeah, at so time this happened. Because sometimes you see lots of people check lots of these historical videos. Some people use it to push a certain narrative, propaganda, whatever, and stuff. And there's some people who sort of want history to be repeated, which doesn't even make any sense at all. Let me know what you think,
90
obviously.
degrees. And in the fog, Somerset now was aware of troops where he thought the Yorkists would be.
Okay.
Even worse, Oxford's banner was not dissimilar to Edward's own banner of the sun in splendour. Confused and fearing that he was about to be overrun by Yorkists, Somerset ordered his archers to fire. Oxford's men, being fired upon with their arrows, now returned that fire. So now what we had was the Lancastrian army fighting itself. Despite now starting to come to the realisation they were actually on the same side, both supposed to be Lancastrians, Oxford and Somerset were now consumed with another terrible thought. Had either of the other two switched sides? You know, the Wars of the Roses are full of supposed allies going over to the enemy or sitting the battle out. So it wasn't actually paranoid thinking. Shouts of treason started to ring out in the fog from both sides. Rumour and panic started to spread through the Lancastrian army that they had been betrayed. And due to the fog, no one could see what was really going on or how big this supposed betrayal actually was. And as the fog finally started to lift, Edward and his brother, the Duke of Gloucester, saw the Lancastrian army in complete disarray, and they drove home their advantage. As he raced to his horse to escape the battlefield, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was cut down. Warwick, the Kingmaker, was dead. Despite being outnumbered, Edward had won the Battle of Barnet. The losses were probably similar, about 1,500 dead on each side. Maybe slightly more Lancastrian than Yorkists, but we're not totally sure. The real impact of the Battle of Barnet, however, was that the most powerful noble and probably the best military commander in England was dead. Furthermore, Edward remained in control of London, and Henry VI, who he'd happened to bring to the battle to witness the battle, was still his prisoner. Edward of York, Edward IV, was back in control. But the House of York still had one opponent who would fight like a lion, or at least like a lioness. Because would you believe, on that very day of the Battle of Barnet, Margaret of Anjou landed with another Lancastrian army on the south coast of England. This War of the Roses was not over yet. So to find out what happened next in this saga at the Battle of Tewkesbury, click on the link that will be appearing in a moment. And in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you very soon.
Oh, interesting. Now it makes total sense why the War of the Roses went on for 30 years. 30. Just imagine war of 30 years. Different battles, all attached, all here. Some people being allies, some people enemies and stuff. Now it makes total sense because I'm sort of like trying to understand like how people fight, like continuously stay in that battle or in that war for 30 years. Obviously there were in betweens and stuff, and now it makes total sense. Now it makes a lot of sense. Wow. You see, history itself is very rich. It's very, very rich. And when you check some, there are lots more to and uncover. And I love it about history because you can never get bored or get tired because you're 1 minute you're realizing or you're learning something from here, and the next you're uncovering another one, and it keeps going and going and going until you be like, wait, what? And mind you, we still haven't checked the English Civil War, which is mind blowing. I don't know. But yeah, let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Obviously, I sort of got confused at the beginning or the initial part of this, but yeah, I think we got a hang of it. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below, obviously, regarding this. I haven't seen the Game of Thrones, so I potentially may really not understand the visual description of this. But again, this sort of makes total sense, and I'm gonna do well to check the other battles as well. Maybe if I can find the Battle of the Warwick, I'm gonna check it as well. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and all that stuff. And until next time, see you in the next video.